I do think that if you look at things across sort of groups and societies and the whole world, there are certain common factors which people think of as evil.
One way of understanding evil is to understand it as undeserved suffering, to understand it as when bad things happen, which can be what we describe as moral evil or natural evil. The distinction between a moral evil and a natural evil, as it's traditionally made, is that a moral evil is something done by one person to another person or group of people. So it's something we do and is more really in line with what we mean by evil when we use it in a normal setting. Natural evil is when the natural world, the operation of natural forces, leads to human suffering. So the results of an earthquake would be described in these terms of definition as natural evil.
It's important, I think, not to press the distinction too hard. There are occasions when moral and natural evil overlap. An example would be a flood that comes about as a result of deforestation, but the deforestation has come about through human action.
I think evil is a much bigger thing than suffering. Suffering is a result of evil rather than the evil itself, I think.
Well, I think that there is a distinction between evil and suffering in the sense that evil is a more comprehensive thing. Evil is something that permeates the whole created order, if you like. And clearly suffering is related to that. Suffering is part of that. Suffering is perhaps a consequence of that.
I wanted to give us a very clear statement of the problem and look at some of the issues that arise out of the problem of evil itself before we go and start looking at the ways in which people have responded. And we're going to look at two key responses today. The problem itself is often listed in rather a logical form. You often get it presented as a logical problem, where you get given three statements, and it's often presented in the idea that not all three statements can be true at once. These three statements are: God is all-loving, God is all-powerful, evil exists.
If you alter any part of those characteristics ascribed to God, then yes, strictly speaking, the problem of evil dissolves. Because the problem of evil is a logical problem, it's based upon a contradiction. Why is there evil in the face of a God who knows all about evil, has the power to act against evil, and wishes to act against evil in that this God is good?
The analogy that you sometimes might find, and I think is quite an effective one, is stolen from the world of kind of criminal investigation. That's to say, God looks down on the world and sees humans suffering, either at the hands of each other or at the hands of natural disaster. He appears to have, from our perspective at least, both the motive and the opportunity to deal with it. He has the motivation to relieve our suffering because he's all-loving. He has this wholly positive thing and wants only good for us. So God has the motive to help us. And if God is truly omnipotent or powerful, has the opportunity to help us, he can help us if he wants to. So why doesn't he? Or why doesn't he or she help us? Don't they want to? Can't they? So it seems that all three statements can't be true. If we deny any one of the statements, the problem goes away. If we say, God is all-loving but isn't all-powerful, no problem. God wants to help us but isn't able to in some respect.
I think the notion of an omnipotent God is a fantasy God, perhaps the projection of a patriarchal society in which men in particular dream of total and absolute power over nature and history.
If we say alternatively that God is all powerful but isn't all loving, likewise, no real problem. What I haven't suggested, and we'll come to look at in a bit more detail, is how we can deny the third statement, that evil exists in the world. So we can get rid of the problem by denying God's omnibenevolence. We can get rid of the problem by denying God's omnipotence. And we will discuss the idea that some Christians have presented under what's called process theodicy, the idea that God has intentionally self-limited his own power as one alternative solution to this problem. But before we get there, we'll look at a different solution, an interesting route, which is to deny the third, to deny the evil. This is a strategy where we say, yes, God is all powerful, yes, God is all loving, and those two are consistent, they're compatible, and consistent with the world as we find it, which may feel, given what I've said at the moment and given your and one's own experience of the outside world, difficult to reconcile. The idea that there is this being who appears to have the motive and opportunity to relieve all the human misery and ills in the world, and yet doesn't appear to. However, this is a line that's been trod by St. Augustine and many Christian theologians, the idea of saying evil does not exist, or denying in some sense the substance or reality of evil. So how can you deny the existence of evil? Well, the existence of evil isn't denied by saying there's no misery and suffering. That would be foolish and just sort of absurd to do so, and admittedly probably offensive. Rather, there's an attempt to deny the full reality of it as a thing. Now, the best way to understand how can we deny the existence of evil as a thing is probably best understood through the work of St. Augustine. St. Augustine was born in what is now modern-day Algeria in 354, and throughout his life he was deeply concerned with his responsibility for what he saw as the wickedness of his early life and questions of evil and sin. Relatively early in his life, St. Augustine joined the Manichees, a heretical sect of Christianity who believed that the world was torn between two contrary powers, the perfectly good creator and the perfectly evil destroyer, and that humans were caught in the middle of some kind of giant cosmic battle. St. Augustine didn't follow this theological approach for long though, and as his swift rise to eminence in Italy took shape, Christianity began to appear to him in a new, intellectually respectable light. His approach to the problem of evil, therefore, comes from a mix between his own personal wranglings and his enthusiasm for rigorous, well-thought-out philosophy.
He is generally regarded as the greatest of Western theologians, very influential both on Catholic theology and on Reformation theology.
St. Augustine worries about evil, quite rightly. I think most conscientious kind of believers do have this genuine worry. And he worries about the extent to which God is responsible for evil. I mean, one of the key themes in any understanding of the problem of evil is the responsibility for human suffering. Whose fault is it?
I mean, very often one can say quite clearly in certain cases that this particular suffering is caused by that particular set of circumstances or actions or those particular people. Suffering is very often down to human beings.
Sort of traditional sense, we would say, okay, it's the fault of humans because of the fall. But then really coming back to the issue, if God is omnipotent, then you could say, well, maybe it's somehow the fault of God.
The Bible also says that we live within a fallen world and there is a certain amount of suffering that we cannot ascribe to our own particular fault, but it's part of the world in which we live.
If God created all things, and evil is a thing, then God created evil. And this denies the essential goodness of God. So this is how he starts out, this is where he starts to worry. Now what St. Augustine does is get round by a route that we'll follow shortly to denying the second of those claims, that evil is a thing.
I think as a first step, it's best not to think about evil as a thing. It's better to think about evil as sourced to individual human acts. Obviously here I'm discussing moral evil.
And that's often the case even when it's not apparently so. For example, some disasters that pass for natural disasters, such as famines and so on, actually raise the question about human responsibility. Why is it that so many people are subject to starvation in Africa? I mean, is that purely a matter of natural resources and conditions and circumstances? Or should we be asking why it is that human beings as a global society allow certain conditions to continue to exist? So sometimes it's not so clear to know where the dividing line comes between the responsibility of human beings for evil and what might be attributed to God.
On some occasions, though, that may seem too easy an answer. So, for example, when we're confronted by what appear to be horrendously evil events, such as the Holocaust, it then I think becomes quite difficult to say, this is to be sourced to one or two individuals acting in this malevolent kind of way. And then evil does acquire a sort of a life of its own, if you like, and it sort of does have the appearance of a thing, so to speak, a kind of social phenomenon for which no one person is entirely responsible.
St. Augustine, well, he goes back to an original premise by saying all things that are created by God are good. He takes this as his starting point. He says, if you're not going to believe this, then you're not even kind of interested in the problem, really. It's one of the starting points for certainly Christian, but most theistic religions, everything that God does is a good thing. All things created by God are good, evil's not good, therefore, evil was not created by God. So he seems to be getting towards his getting God off the hook, as it were, for the responsibility of the pain, misery and suffering in the world. He continues on with his reasoning. He says, after this, God creates everything. God creates everything there is. Well, we've already seen, God didn't create evil. He's just proved that, he believes. Therefore, evil is not a thing. And sometimes people do think, has someone just kind of pulled a fast one on me here? Has evil just been made to disappear behind his back with a mirror temporarily? But I think he sustains his argument, and it's been a key piece of thinking in Christian theology and thinking about evil, that somehow you're able to say evil isn't a substantive thing. Rather, evil isn't a solid substance in the world, but an absence.
This idea of that evil is a sort of absence of good seems to me to be, I find that fairly satisfactory.
Good is seen as a positive thing created by God, or the world is good. Where the world goes wrong, where there's a deficiency in the world, that is what we call evil.
I think evil is underestimated if it is described simply as an absence of good.
Well, yeah, if you define its absence of good, but I would say that there are things which are neutral, which you can't say whether they're good or evil from a personal perspective.
There are situations in which you think there's a presence of evil here somehow. And that just seems to me to be not terribly well served by being described as a kind of absence or privation of something good.
Whether or not you're satisfied with that definition is another matter, but it's certainly one of the key approaches to it, is to say that evil isn't a thing for which God is therefore responsible, but rather an absence of it, or alternatively, to say the world is good and was created as good by God, and evil, badness, wickedness, immorality is when the world goes wrong, is where there's an absence of how things should be, or when God's plan has been thwarted, and not thwarted by God, but thwarted by humans.
But supposing you were to take the role of God in good and evil, if you had like 3 statements, each says, if we assume God to be all-powerful and all-loving, and if we're to assume that evil exists, which do you sort of honestly think you could refute out of those 3 statements that would still make sense?
I think we have to ask ourselves what a world would be like without freedom or suffering.
Do you think like evil is like no substance, like Augustine was saying?